take that long to send between accounts. There it is. M-A-R-K, right?
Just do a different one. Do M-Mater.
M. Okay.
At Mertz, M-E-R-T-Z, Productions with an S.com.
Is that it?
Yep, that's me. Yep. Cool.
There you go. Good luck.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Knecht, and I'm the site administrator here at Drakewell Museum. And on behalf of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, I want to welcome you to today's events here at Drakewell. Just a couple housekeeping things to cover. Restrooms are through the door in the back. There's also restrooms across the front of the museum up here. If there is an emergency, there's an emergency exit in the back. You go out that door and make a right and go out to the parking lot area, or you can go this way through this door on my left and exit through the front of the building. But it looks like there's a very full schedule today. We're glad you're all here in Venango County, northwestern Pennsylvania, and hope you enjoy the day. I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Good morning, this is Mark. Can you all see me and hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Mark. Welcome.
I'm just going to go on mute until my session comes on.
Very well. Thanks for joining.
Okay, hi, I'm Labia.
Sabah
I'm
al-khair,
also going to go on mute.
Sabah al-khair, Dr. Dabia. Great. Fantastic. Greetings, everyone. My name is Andrew Tabler, as Michael mentioned, and welcome to the second annual Drake Energy Security Conference. It's so good for you to be here with us today. The weather is fantastic. It was really hit or miss. Literally anything can happen in Western Pennsylvania concerning weather, especially at this time of the year. And we're so glad that you'll be able to join us. A little bit different than last year, we are also part of our time going to be outside under the tent, which I think you saw, which allows us to enjoy some of this beautiful weather. We thought it was going to be quite rainy, so fingers crossed. So my day job is as a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. But today, I am here in my personal capacity as an Oil City native, a former U.S. official, and also a former Drake Well intern 30 years ago last summer. Yeah, it was a great experience. Drake Well has always been close to my heart. Everywhere I went, all over the world, I saw the imprint of the history of this place throughout my time in the Middle East. It allowed me to have intelligent conversations with Middle Eastern officials, to the common people, and also I expressed to them what we all know here to be, but they did not fully understand, to be the concept of oil on the brain, and what petroleum production does to those who benefit from it oftentimes, and certainly Middle Eastern leaders a la Muammar Gaddafi, et cetera, et cetera. But he's now gone, and here we are. So this year's conference theme is Back to the Future, Energy's Past and its Lessons for Powering a Sustainable and Prosperous Tomorrow. It expands on our deliberations last year on energy security and national security. One of the biggest takeaways across the spectrum of attendees was that greater dialogue was needed between experts on energy, climate, and the environment in order to solve the difficult dilemmas facing all three fields against the backdrop of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and greater great power competition in the world. So those deliberations helped inform what we were going to do, but also we had the direct comments of the community here. And that included from those that were attending and those that heard about the conference. And I was sent via post not too long ago, as a result of the last year's conference, a poem called Ode to Oil City. And I'd like to read it to you, if you don't mind. With blood, sweat, and tears, the oil was mined. With dreams of the future they would find. Fortunes were made, the city did thrive, and there were beautiful homes and a sense of pride. Storefronts and mansions appeared on the scene, derricks and steeples rose in between. Industries came from afar and near to make this city be revered. This prosperity did not last, now it is a memory of the past. Now walking through our city, what do we see? No storefronts, no industries, no vitality. Erie has the lake, Pittsburgh has steel, Hershey has chocolate, Oil City has no deals. This quaint little city, tucked in the hills, with black gold and gas, lies idly still. Oil City's heritage and wealth has been robbed of its natural resources made by God. Imposed regulations keep wealth in the ground, with commitment and foresight could be found. With modern-day technology, industries could rise. This quaint little city could be revived. I can't tell you how many times I've read this, and I think it really accurately reflects a lot of the frustrations of the local community, both in terms of the state of the community, particularly Oil City, but also in terms of the economy and also the struggle of regulation. We got into that a little bit yesterday in our deliberations over about possibilities of taking lithium out of brine. And for as heartfelt as these comments are about the ability to go back to the past, this poem is still, based on my experience here, incomplete. The fact is that a lot of the future of this area is actually in the fact that Mother Nature took back the environmental destruction, which you will find throughout this museum in photos, and that it's that wealth that is now probably equal to its mineral wealth, the future of this area, right? And that's what makes coming to this place and to deliberate the nexus of climate and energy very special. So today's deliberations, we now call, in our new, as a result of listening to attendees last year and listening to poems like this and others, other people who were reacting from the local community, we could now call them the Drake Dialogues between energy and climate experts. They are named in honor of Edwin Drake's tenacity and creativity, which produced America's first oil discovery in 1859. Global and local experts, practitioners, and leaders have gathered today to discuss and debate the future of energy security and climate. They include hybrid interactive presentations with panelists giving introductory remarks, and we have some of them already logged on, followed by a free-flowing dialogue and questions and answers. So, as I mentioned, today's deliberations were, the conference itself was kicked off yesterday down in Oil City. We focused on energy transition issues and the community. We started out at Venango campus, where we took a look at the Barbara Morgan Harvey collection, went over to the auditorium, had a discussion about the possibilities and the basics of hydrogen and the spectrum of hydrogen sources. Then we looked at the problem of brine from this area throughout the world, actually, resulting from petroleum and gas production, what to do about it, and is it possible to derive some profit streams from that, what has otherwise been regarded as a waste product. Then we headed over to the former Wolf's Head refinery in Reno, and we had a great opportunity to tour that facility with its current owners, the Zackrells, and to look at a little bit of our history. I certainly remember that refinery operating. I'm sure many of you do too. And then, in any case, they're now looking at the future, and they had more, like all of us, had more questions than answers. Then we headed over to the Wenango Country Club. We had a great presentation by one of our collaborators, the Oil Region Alliance, on the possibilities of recreation in the area and tourism. We then headed over to the National Transit Building, where the ORA was joined by the Venango Area Chamber of Commerce and a group presentation with Arts of Oil City. And we both talked about the history of Rockefeller's National Transit Building with a little bit of an eye towards the future plans of the community and also the future plans and operations concerning the arts in the National Transit Building itself. And that was very, very meaningful. We also were joined by Robert McNally, who's going to be our keynote speaker today. And Bob was able to log on. He's unable to join us today because of a family tragedy, but he's joining us from remote. And he was able to talk to us a little bit about, which could be described as that hallowed ground in a way, that one block there at the corner of Seneca and Center Street. From there, the price of oil was set probably for approximately 30 years altogether, and that's worldwide. So that would be the equivalent of you looking in the paper today and looking what the price of Brent is, or West Texas Intermediate, or the other oil grades throughout the world. So, and he really helped us, I think, put that into perspective. And then, of course, we went over to the Oil City Council chambers for the signing of a first-ever sister city agreement between Oil City and the Sabail district of the Azerbaijani capital, Baku, which is home to the country's first oil well in 1846. So we were all doing this. So who is we? The Drake Energy Security Forum is a grassroots initiative of Pennsylvania Oil Heritage Region residents, natives, and nonprofits committed to putting our community back on the global energy and climate map. For the second year in a row, the forum hosts an annual energy security conference to debate the lessons of energy's past and how they can help America and the world chart a course towards a sustainable and prosperous future. Before the pandemic, most conferences like this took place in Houston, London, almost very seldomly in the American heartland. But now, with a long afternoon drive from New York City or Washington, D.C., preferable in some cases, especially when you have great weather, the leaves are changing color and you don't hit a deer. The energy history, natural beauty of Northwest Pennsylvania every October serves as a perfect retreat for energy and climate experts to quietly discuss the growing nexus between energy, climate, and national security. Our slogan this year, we set the bar in the middle, to be fair, is better and slightly bigger. What does that mean? It means we have twice the in-person attendees of last year, and thanks to a recently installed broadband connection by the Friends of Drake Well, Inc., the nonprofit organization, which is a fantastic one, and you'll be meeting them today, that supports the museum's education mission, we are able to host guests from all over the world. Of course, I mentioned that we have our partners, the Oil Region Alliance and the Venango Area Chamber of Commerce. I very much appreciate everything that they've been able to do with us today. and to make this happen. Just one second. Okay. I'm dealing with the logins. The run of play today is fairly simple. You have programs, I believe you were presented in the conference bags. You'll notice the leave motif on them we've developed, with the idea being that we do this every October in celebration of this beautiful time of the year. We will go through a number of sessions. We're going to start out first with a panel, with a keynote address by Bob McNally, who I'm not sure is logged on yet. Is Bob logged on yet, Mark? Just one second. Okay, just one second. And so what will happen is, as a result of this, Bob's, and I'll give his intro here in a second, Bob's book, Crude Volatility, which you all should read if you haven't, we have purchased, as a result of the conference, a number of copies to be available outside, the sales of which are a fundraiser for the Friends of Drake Wells. So if you can buy the book here, we'll take your address and phone number. I'm gonna take them down to Bob. He's gonna sign them for you, and then we're gonna make sure we get them to you. All you gotta do is just remember your home address. And if you don't remember your home address, you're probably not gonna get not only that book, but a lot of other things. So anyways, cross your fingers. Does anybody have any questions about anything? Am I missing anything? There is Wi-Fi. The password, the kernel Wi-Fi is the Wi-Fi, and the password is the number 1 lowercase a, 2 lowercase b, 3 lowercase c, 4 lowercase d. Oh, sorry. There it is again. Yep.
Andrew, this is Mark Finley joining remotely. I can't see the room or the speakers. The camera that's displaying is showing a poster of Al Unser on the wall, and that's all I can see of the event.
Okay, we're just kicking off, Mark, but we can hear you if you can hear us.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So unlike last year, last year's deliberations were largely off the record. We did that in order to foster frank talk and open debate, which I think we were successful in doing. However, carrying out things off the record isn't necessarily ideal for trying to change people's ideas in their minds concerning the nexus of energy and climate. And so we decided this year to go on the record. And so these sessions are being live streamed this year. So whatever you say is going to be memorialized in perpetuity, I guess, or as long as we're all here on planet Earth and our website is able to operate. Let's see here. Yes. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, has Bob been able to log on yet? No. Okay, all right, we'll just wait for a second. One of the great things about this year is that we have this broadband connection that allows us to connect to the world and to have people beaming in. One of the challenges is getting everybody lined up and logged on at that time. So let me take this time then a little bit before Bob hopefully logs on to talk a little bit about, we couldn't do this. Last year we kind of did it on a very much a shoestring budget. And we begged, borrowed, and stole. No, actually not literally, but we actually asked people for a lot of favors. And we did have a number of donors who did provide some materials and some financial support, but it was relatively limited, and a lot of people had to commit considerable personal resources to that. So this year we have, in particular, three entities which have provided us with an unbelievable amount of support. The first is the Commonwealth Foundation, and I can't thank them enough. It's hard enough to go and convince people to come and attend an event, or let alone to support it, and to say, we're going to hold an event on energy and climate. You might not like everything you're going to hear or everybody we invite, but I want you to trust us, and we just move forward together and we have that debate. And I really appreciated the trust that I got from Commonwealth. I really appreciate everything that they've been able to provide, and we've been able to get to know them over the last few days. So thank you so much for that support. We couldn't do it without you. Second is the Heritage Foundation. Heritage Foundation also stepped up in a similar way. A lot of trust there. Between Commonwealth and Heritage, I would say we were, with maybe more of the technical onerous on Commonwealth, we were able to, we're going to have the concluding panel today, the 2024 climate and energy in the 2024 election. And that's going to be a series of about 10 different politicians who are, who have made 3-minute videos on the issue of energy. It's in response to a set question that we gave to everybody. They're going to be joined by Scott Hutchinson and Lee James, who are going to be here in the flesh, together with my former boss from the NSC, Victoria Coates. And together, we're going to think a little bit about where energy and climate might be playing into the election in front of us. So thank you. We have also our silver sponsors, the Seneca Resources Company. They were with us last year. Really appreciate everything that you've been able to do. I'm not sure if is there a rep today from Seneca? I'm not sure if they're here yet, but we met yesterday and really appreciated their support. Very nice of them. But we also have a number of Wildcatter sponsors, those that were able to give in increments that helped us cover different line items of the conference. One returning from last year is Webco in Oil City. Side Hustle Brews and Spirits, of course. We manage it, and my colleague Hind Carnes. But we also have some new players. We have the Barbara Morgan Harvey Center for the Study of Oil Heritage, the monies of which went to covering lodging for a number of guests. We also have my friend Tatiana Anderson with Starfield Media here today, giving us her best advice about the way forward and what we can do with this. And of course, last but not least, we have one of our local stars, Nancy Cubbin, who has stepped up, and I told her, Nancy, we need an internet connection to make this conference happen, and friends at Drake Well, and she stepped up, and it happened. And we really appreciate your support for all of that, because without it, we wouldn't be able to do this. And by the way, that internet connection will go for an entire year, and it will support everything that the Friends of Drake Well are doing, and are doing educationally and otherwise. Okay, and then of course, last but not least, today we will have another heritage dinner hosted by the Republic of Azerbaijan in the evening. That is for conference attendees and also folks from the community as well. It's going to be down at the Titusville Ironworks. And last year's was a real hit. There's always a lot of lamb involved, which they are the world's experts on, in my opinion, among them. And I think you'll all really enjoy it. So let me see where we are on the connection. Do we have anything, Mark? No. Okay. So maybe we just take a little break. Hold on. It said, I'm waiting for you to let me in. It says that you need to start the... Just give us a few moments, folks. This might be a good time to get coffee or something while we run out the clock. He's connecting, okay.
Safe driving mode. The hell?
Bob, can you hear us?
I can hear you, but I can hear you. But my Zoom says it's in safe driving mode, which is odd. And can you hear me?
We can, yeah, we can. Yeah, it's probably because you are either moving and or your phone thinks you're moving.
Can you hear me and can you see me?
We can hear you. Can we see him?
We're trying to get his presentation on this laptop.
Okay. You can see him as well, Mark? Yeah, okay. Just a moment, Bob. We're getting your presentation loaded up. Glad to be connected with you. So while we're waiting for this, and hopefully we get it sorted out, let me introduce Bob, who's our keynote speaker today. And when I went to go and see Bob earlier this year to okay. Sorry, when I went to go see Bob earlier this year to come and speak to us, I met him and I gave him my stump speech. And my stump speech I couldn't read off of. We were meeting.
Hey guys,
Hello?
if you can't, it's more important that they see the slides than see me. So if you're unable to load the slides, I suggest I come back in through my computer. I will be in a pencil sketch, but I think I can load and show the slides. So why don't we try that if you think there's going to be a problem loading the slides?
Good question. Just 1 second. Okay, Bob, that sounds like a good plan B to us. Go ahead.
All right, stand by.
Okay. So let me take
I
this
can,
time.
well, actually, we can have it both. I think I can log in. Perhaps we can do it both ways, where I can have my iPhone on and log in from the computer for the slides.
Okay.
So I'm waiting to be joined. So if someone would just let me in, this is in the new. There we go. And then I'll need to be able to share my screen. Wonderful. Okay. And then shares. Okay, it says host has disabled participant screen sharing. So if you would please enable my screen sharing. I'm going to turn off my audio.
Recording in progress.
Host is disabled. Screen sharing. I'm going to go.
We're getting a feedback loop on you, Bob.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. I just closed out the other one, so I'm just on with my my computer now. So if you all could just, all I need is the last step is just to enable that participant screen sharing, and we're good.
So let me use this dead time to introduce Bob, a very much alive person, I assure you. So when I went to see Bob a few months ago to come up and talk to us, I had to meet him at the Metropolitan Club in Washington. And the Metropolitan Club has a rule: you're not allowed to have any electronics, and no papers or business papers are allowed to be carried out in that facility. So I had to commit to everything from memory. Which at my age is now, and after being in government, it's not that easy anymore. And so, but this issue is kind of in my heart. So I had the first 3 lines memorized, more or less, and then the 4th was there, and the 5th was a little less clear, and that's kind of how I went into it. And of course, luckily, I was going to meet with Bob, who knows our community and knows its history. And I got about 3 sentences in, and he said, "Oh, that's it. I'm in. Yeah, I'm coming." We had to work out the days when he was coming, and he said, "You know, I was up there before the pandemic. I think what you're doing is great, and I had actually a lot of the same ideas." That led to nailing down these days, and Bob, unfortunately, is unable to join us today because of a family tragedy, but that's okay. He joined me last week at the Washington Institute for a very prescient panel concerning the 50th anniversary of the 6 October War, which led to a huge spike in oil prices. Bob talked about that with Brenda Schaefer, who's also going to be with us here today, although I don't see her yet, and also Michael Ratner, who's over here from Congressional Research Services, who's one of our moderators today. And of course, all of that seems academic, very much so, about the oil weapon in light of the war that's kicked off between Israel and Hamas recently and threatens to engulf the region. But let me get to Bob here. Bob McNally is the founder and president of Rapidan Energy Group, a Washington, D.C.-based independent energy market policy and geopolitical consulting firm. Bob's 32-year career includes service as a White House energy advisor to President George W. Bush, an oil market analyst, and a hedge fund strategist at Tudor Investment Corporation. His acclaimed book, Crude Volatility, The History and the Future of Boom-Bust Oil Prices, won the IAEE Marcel Bautier Best International Energy Economics Book Award in 2023. It's an excellent book, and as I mentioned, we have it for sale here, and we'll arrange to get you some signed copies from Bob. From 2001 to 2003, he served as special assistant to the president on the White House National Security Council, and in 2003, senior director for international energy on the NSC as well. Bob earned his BA in political science and international relations from the American University and his MA in international economics and foreign policy from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. We've asked Bob today to craft a very good presentation, I think, at least what I've seen of the slides, on the conference's central theme, Back to the Future, question mark, Energy's Past and its Lessons for Powering a Sustainable and Prosperous Tomorrow. Okay, over to you, Bob, if you can hear us.
I can. Thank you, Andrew. That was a very kind and lengthy introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm assuming you all can hear my voice and you can see my screen, the title screen, Back to the Future. We could just get those 2 checks. If I could have a verbal on that, I'll just launch here.
Yes, we do.
You seeing it?
Yes, we do.
Awesome, great. Listen, thank you so much for accommodating me, and sorry for these glitches. I was, as I mentioned to some of you yesterday, when I beamed in at the transit building, the SEEP building, I was en route there to be with you in person, and so looking forward to it. But we had some tragic news really affecting a very close friend of my wife, and I had to come home to support her. So that's why I'm not there. But I'm envious of you all being there. It's a beautiful part of the world, and I've asked Andrew to reserve me a spot for next year. Can't wait to be there in person. I know Michael and Victoria, a few others are there that I know in addition to Andrew. And again, I'm envious of all you all, and thank you for accommodating me here. So I thought in the time that I had here, I just look back, look around, and then look forward and ask ourselves, what about the history and the innovation and the learnings, if you will, from the oil regions are remotely, kind of relevant for now and maybe where we're going. And I think there's just a lot that history can reveal to us, and it's fascinating in its own right, but also I think helpful. So I'm going to advance the slide and hope that works. And there you see crude oil price volatility. So let's just start with that. The thing most everybody on the planet cares about is the price of oil. We may not focus on who produces it or who consumes it, or we may not be analyzing its stocks, but just about everybody cares about, I think, in the industrializing world anyway, blessed with modern energy, thinks about this, the price of oil. And to say that oil prices are volatile is not to divulge new information, right? But it's also the case that we really haven't seen the type of volatility in crude oil prices over the past 20 years in the prior sort of almost 100 years, like 90 years. So if you look at the period before 2008, and I'll show you really going back to the early 1930s, you know, the oil market, those of us of a certain age are familiar with growing up, is a fairly well-managed market. And what you saw in history was you'd get these oil price spikes for one of two reasons. One would be a war in the Arabian Gulf region, the Middle East. That would usually cause a spike. And then a recession, those gray bars in the chart, would cause oil price to go down by hurting demand. An exception was 1986 when Saudi Arabia flooded the market to sort of teach a lesson to its cheating OPEC counterparts. But that was the exception that proves the rule that until recently anyway, oil prices don't go down unless there's a recession. And they only go up when there's a war in the Arabian Gulf. But if you look at the recent history, we had a near quintupling of oil prices starting about 20 years ago without a war in the Middle East. Yes, it was after the second Iraq war, but that was not the main reason oil prices nearly quintupled from 2003 to 2008. And then if you look in 2014, prices collapsed without a recession and without anybody flooding the market. Yes, on Thanksgiving Day of 2014, Saudi Arabia and Russia didn't get along. Russia refused to contribute cuts, and Saudi Arabia said, okay, well then we'll just keep producing, and the price collapsed, even though the Saudis didn't ramp up production. But the market realized we don't have a kind of a supply regulator anymore. In any event, you've seen now we've just had one black swan after the other with COVID, and now recessionary risks and so forth, and now another war in the Middle East. So my point is that the amplitude and the causes of recent oil price volatility ought to leave everybody scratching their head and asking, how can this be? Why do we have this? And you know, most folks say, well, let's look at history. And for most folks, the history of the oil market that's relevant starts with what we're commemorating here this month, the 50th anniversary of the Arab oil embargo of October 1973. As if nothing could have happened in the oil market before October 1973 that would explain to us why we're on this price roller coaster, much less what we should expect in the future, especially as we attempt to transition. And so let's dig into that a little bit. As you may have already guessed, I think you have to look before the Arab oil embargo of 1973 to understand why we are on Space Mountain in terms of oil price volatility. And when you do that, and here's a continuous monthly crude oil price series I developed for my book with the help of my able research assistant then, Fernando Ferreira, who now runs our geopolitical practice. And so that inside box there shows you prices before the Arab oil embargo in 1973. And what it sort of shows you is that the oil market has alternated between extended multi-decade periods of relative calm and then wild volatility. It's never perfectly stable, the price of oil. But and what determined whether we were in an era of wild boom-bust price cycles or a relatively stable price environment is whether we had the presence of something that normally doesn't exist in the oil market, a supply manager. A supply manager meaning a group of industry or countries, more recently, producers, that decide to regulate the supply side of oil in order to temper oil's intrinsic proneness to wild volatility. Real quick, I know everyone out there knows economics, I don't have to belabor this, but oil is prone to wild price volatility because both supply and demand are very inelastic or unresponsive to prices in the short run. Oil on the demand side is a must-have commodity for which there's few scalable substitutes. And on the supply side, it takes a long time to find and develop oil production especially, and once you do, you don't toggle it up and down. You run it. So when you have a commodity for which demand and supply are very inelastic, whenever you have an imbalance in supply and demand, you need enormous price swings to achieve slight changes in production and consumption to balance the market. That's just the economics 101. So this was very clear to the early operators in what was then the Saudi Arabia of the oil market, Western Pennsylvania, the oil regions, Franklin, where you are in Oil City, Titusville, of course. And so, and you see that in the volatility there in the first part, those first decades. I mean, it was just crazy, boom and bust galore. You know, when producers couldn't sell their oil and the prices crashed to pennies on the barrel, they would be dumping the oil into rivers, right? And then the price would soar because oil or kerosene then was such a better alternative than turpentine or whale oil for illumination. Remember, because oil in the beginning was about illumination, not transportation. The demand would grow very strongly, and then the price would rise, and drillers would come back in. I'm sure you've seen pictures in the museum there about all the wells and the waste and the pollution and everything. It's just wild. And so Mr. Rockefeller comes along. Well, I should say, first of all, the industry, we first saw in response to this wild volatility and chaos in the oil regions, we began to see the beginnings of what we see up until today, which is producers getting together and saying, we have to tame the beast. We cannot allow this wild price volatility to perpetuate itself. We can't stay in business, and we can't grow the market. And so you started to see, and I'm going to slip to my next slide here. We may go back to that earlier one. There's a picture of the wild, the development in the region. You know, what you saw there were little OPECs. The volatility has always imparted an impulse for the industry to integrate, for producers to get together and say, we gotta coordinate production here. This is crazy. Actually, the first attempt at what we now know as sort of OPEC or a cartel or a supply manager was something called the Oil Creek Association of 1861. And there were a number of other similar attempts of producing, and by the way, governments were not involved here. This is just the industry doing this, to tame the beast of volatility, which you tended to see where producers would band together against refiners. There was a lot of, in those early decades, not only competition among refiners and among producers, but between the two groups and so forth. Anyway, it's a long history. And these proto-OPECs inevitably failed because of cheating outside, divisions within, new production, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and there's, I think that's a picture of Mr. Seep there, who you saw yesterday, young Joseph Seep, who came together with Rockefeller. I'm going to go back here. There's a picture of Rockefeller. Rockefeller comes in as a refiner, looks at this chaos and says, no can do. And so he basically, long story, but he basically organizes all the refiners into one big group using some nefarious methods, which got him in trouble with progressives in a few decades later. And then he sort of allied with what we call midstream now, the pipelines, the railroads, and eventually owned and controlled most of them. And he basically sort of indirectly controlled the supply of oil, not by going and regulating those drillers per se, or regulating prices per se, but by controlling how those drillers were able to sort of transfer their oil and sell it into the market, but both getting it onto rails and anyway. So Rockefeller brings us the first era of relative stability, and this enables oil to flourish. And you know, in this age of electricity and electric cars and biofuels, we got to remember, as we're entering the 1800s, we're leaving that period. We're getting into transportation. We figured out electricity for illumination, and there were competitors to oil and transportation. The first cars were electric. You know, a lot of folks thought we were going to have electric cars instead of gasoline cars. Gasoline was a waste product. Also, alcohol, biofuels, ethanol was being used as well. One of the reasons that the industry, the automotive industry, went with oil is because of the stability Rockefeller brought to us. Hold on to that thought. Stable price is very important for industry to grow. There are other reasons. Oil's more dense, et cetera, but that's stability. Now, but we busted up Standard Oil in the progressive era after 1911. It was outlawed. It was broken up. And Rockefeller got in a lot of trouble. And his nemesis, Ida Tarbell, whose father was put out of business by Rockefeller, you know, and she just excoriated this guy. But you know what? She gave him credit, actually. People didn't criticize Rockefeller for bringing stability to prices. He actually said it was a good thing. It's pretty amazing he did that. They didn't like the trust formations, the nefarious methods that companies like Standard Oil used routinely back in the day. So we busted up Standard Oil. What happened? The last boom bust era before the one we're in right now. Now oil is becoming a transportation fuel. After World War I, there were price spikes as demand increased. We're all getting into cars. And that volatility, that beast of volatility returned. And in response to that, first you had a boom after World War I and then a bust. And now oil production is shifting mainly to Texas and the Gulf regions. So in response to this bust in oil prices in the early 1930s, you had Texas, of all places, Texans, Oklahomans, people put on earth, in my view, by God, to produce oil and limit the role of government in business. In order to vanquish oil price volatility, they created the most heavy-handed government regulation, not only of the oil industry, but I think of almost any commodity I'm aware of. The Texas Railroad Commission started issuing quotas backed by the police power of the state in 1932 and did so for 4 decades. Every month they met, and they made OPEC look like softies. They imposed quotas well by well, field by field, not just state by state. Anyway, Texas, working with the Seven Sisters, brings us the most stable period we've ever had in oil prices from 1932 to 1972. Now, OPEC takes over from Texas, right? It was founded by a Venezuelan guy who was in exile in the United States in the 1950s, an oil guy. He goes down and says, this is amazing. Texas Railroad Commission gets together, looks at some numbers, imposes these quotas, keeps oil prices stable. We got to do this. There's a revolution in Venezuela. He's the oil minister. He's in power. He goes to Saudi Arabia and says, you got to see this. The two of them go to Austin, Texas. They hire a guy from the Texas Railroad Commission and says, you got to show us how to do this. This is amazing how you guys regulate and control this market. OPEC takes over. And then, OPEC, in my view, lost control in 2008, the same way the Texas Railroad Commission lost control in 1972. They ran out of spare capacity in peacetime. They no longer were able to control the market. And I want to say, I'll never win broad support for this, but I want to start a campaign to start commemorating March of 1972, rather than October of 1973, is the main is sort of the real moment when the oil market shifted. Because in March of 1972, the Texas Railroad Commission lost 4 decades of control of the oil market. It ran out of spare capacity. What is spare capacity? When a swing producer or supply manager reduces oil supply by order of the state to manage prices, they create something that normally doesn't exist, quickly producible oil. That exists as a buffer and in case there's a disruption. And that is really, if you're a central bank, those are your reserves. Spare capacity, to paraphrase Mao Zedong, power in the global oil market flows through the barrel of spare production capacity. The willingness to create it and the ability to use it. We ran out in March of 1972. OPEC, really Saudi Arabia, took over. And in my view, their era ended in 2008 when Saudi Arabia, like the Texas Railroad Commission, ran out of spare capacity in peacetime. Okay, we're going to go forward now. Shameless plug for the book. Sorry, we won't dwell here too long. I know I think you're going to be selling those, but there's this thing. Just the picture there of the Texas National Guard being mobilized and sent into the fields, literally to prod drillers away from their wells, their private property, at bayonet point. This is Texas. Hold on to that idea, the extent that which governments, even free market loving oil producing governments like the state of Texas, would go to stabilize the price of, the lifeblood of modern civilization. Here's a quick look at the implications for oil price volatility of having a swing producer and not. So I took my monthly continuous crude oil price series, going back to 1859. I did a min-max percentage change for each year, and then I averaged those over these eras that I've demarcated. I'm happy to provide this monthly data to anyone who wants it, and you can run your own volatility and slice and dice it in different ways. People can differ how we draw the eras and so forth, but this is how I do it. Again, I think it shows you first boom bust in the oil regions, utter chaos. Rockefeller comes in, cuts it in half. We bust up Rockefeller back to high volatility. Of course, as the industry matured and built out inventories, that reduces the volatility, doesn't get rid of it, but that's why, boom bust 2 was much lower than boom bust 1. Texas comes in practicing communism and crushes oil price volatility. Most stable period we've ever had. OPEC takes over from Texas, does about as well as Rockefeller. And then since then, we haven't really had an effective, durable swing producer, in my view, and that's why we're back on Space Mountain. So looking forward, let's look forward a little bit. There's kind of two views of the way the world's going to work. This is that spare production capacity estimate, percent as expressed as percent of global oil market production. So you see how the line is really high there. 1/3 of global oil market production was held in spare in the 1950s. Let's just stop there for a second. What commodity are you familiar with, much less one as important to the world as oil, where government regulators will shut in 1/3 of the world's production to keep prices stable? I'm not aware of any. And that's Texas doing that in the 1950s. The 1950s was actually the most unbalanced market period we've ever had. And had there not been a Texas Railroad Commission, we wouldn't be celebrating the 73 would have been a blip. We would all be talking about things that, how the world changed in the 1950s. The world didn't change in the 1950s because Texas was managing the market. All right. Looking forward, that line now, of course, is really OPEC plus, it's Saudi Arabia. There's kind of two views of the world. The consensus view that's represented by the International Energy Agency, and I think most banks and folks who publish forecasts, is that we're about to see peak demand for oil. We're about to witness a very high penetration of fuel-efficient gasoline cars due to policy, and then eventually EV penetration is going to soar so fast that demand for transportation, by far the largest share of oil is in transportation, is going to collapse, first in the OECD, and then it's going to slow down elsewhere, such that the world demand for oil is going to peak. Now the IEA is saying it's going to be even before 2030. So we're, and 5 years, 6 years, 7 years from now, that's tomorrow in the oil industry. So if you believe that we're on this peak demand path, then the spare capacity is that light blue line. That sort of says that, we can't produce much oil going forward. We've had a collapse in investment since 2014, but that's not a real problem because we're about to basically turn oil into a stranded asset, and we're going to be driving EVs so fast that we won't run out of oil, if you will, spare capacity, because it's running out of spare capacity that ought to concern all of us. That's what puts us back. It keeps us in these boom bust eras. Now, maybe you've detected in my voice, Rapidan's view is very different than the consensus. We don't think there's any evidence whatsoever to believe that we're on track for peak demand by 2030. And so in our view, demand is going to exceed supply growth, and Saudi Arabia, OPEC, is going to lose what's left of spare production capacity, and the multi-year bust phase that we just exited, sort of 2014 to 2021, is going to be followed as night follows day with a boom phase. So hold on, buckle up for that. So the real question then is, do we have an effective swing producer? Because that's the only thing that history shows us will give us some modicum of stability that we need, not only for the oil industry to be helpful, but also to, I think, successfully bring on alternatives to oil. Although that does cut both ways, as I'll explain shortly. Okay, here are the attributes of a swing producer. Listed to the left, right? You got to have the legal power to do it. You have to have the size, the control, et cetera, et cetera. Texas Railroad Commission had it. OPEC had it. Shale does not have it. I know it was fashionable for a while to think the shale was going to be the new swing producer. That was fashionable in 2015 and 2016. Well, that's been proven to be false. OPEC Plus, we're all aware of OPEC Plus, a new Saudi, Russia-led group, including both OPEC and about an equal number of non-OPEC producers. Well, I mean, I think the jury's still out. We've seen them with success, and we've seen them with failure. And as I pointed out to you, even in the early days of the oil regions in Pennsylvania, you had temporary cartels form, but then they ended up blowing apart. Well, OPEC Plus, as we saw spectacularly in 2020, fell apart, and oil went to one point negative $37 in May of 2020. So, I think you could argue whether OPEC Plus is going to be an effective swing producer, a durable one. You could argue, reasonable people could take both sides of that argument. Again, in my view, it doesn't really matter because in the coming years, we're going to run out of spare capacity because I don't think demand's going to be about to peak. And we're going to miss not having a swing producer. And that's the lesson really from the oil regions till today. So final slide, and I want to look forward a little bit. And this kind of gets to this idea of rapid decarbonization, or what's called the transition and so forth. And, I think in some ways, as we think about it, there are two risks. One is not being aware of history and the importance of stability. And in energy, and the other is status quo bias, thinking that things in the future will always be as they are now or have been recently, in a recent sort of 3 to 5 year period. Now, here is a sort of the graph that I'm showing you there is a sort of a representation of how investors are valuing, let's call it the old oil industry, the black line being the S&P Oil and Gas Producer ETF. And then the blue line, the light blue line, I probably should have made it green, is the European Renewable Energy Index, but that could be almost anything. That could be the ARC ETF, if you're familiar with that, or there are others, kind of ETFs that represent investments primarily in renewables, alternative energy, et cetera. So as usual, now I love history, so I'm dividing things into eras. If you look at the period from 2009 to 2014, I call that build it in China and they will come. Right? The U.S. was distracted by the Asian financial crisis. Europe was moving ahead on climate, but not really the U.S. But China was like, we see which way things are going here. The world's going to decarbonize, and we are going to be the workhorse, the machine the factory of decarbonization. We're going to dominate both in power and transportation, renewable energy minerals, critical minerals, rare earth minerals, refining, chips, wind, solar panels, everything, EVs. We're going to build those industries at home. We're going to acquire the resources internationally. And then when the world comes and gets ready to decarbonize, they're going to come to China. It's going to be a made in China transition. And so you can see, though, at this point, oil and gas are doing very well. Oil is $100 a barrel. The investors really hadn't caught on. China's doing this kind of quietly. Well, then we have the period of 2015 to 2020, and that is what I call it the euphoric plateau with very, very sunny conditions for green energy, right? First of all, oil prices collapsed during this era, and so oil was hurting from that. But we had the Paris Agreement. We had countries committing to hard targets and implementing policies and so forth. And yes, Trump was an outlier, but then Trump lost, and Biden came in. The first thing he did was sign the Paris Agreement. Look how growth in green energy was at the end of that period, right? And I think a lot of us may still be sort of thinking that we're in that sunny environment. And we talk about the transition as if it's a given, peak demand as if it's a given, and our proceeding thinks from that. Our thinking proceeds from that. But if you look since 2021, I would argue every single one of the conditions that made for sunny weather from 2015 to 2020 has reversed. Oil prices are now high, not low. Interest rates are high, not low. Inflation's high, not low. China, this is very important, China's not going to be the cheap supplier of a transition. Even Europeans are turning away from that idea. We'd rather have a slow transition and do it at home or with friendshoring. China's becoming an adversary. And I didn't have a chance to update the deck since last Saturday. Instead of peace, great power peace, we have now a hot war in Eastern Europe with a major superpower, Russia, and now another one getting started in the Middle East. So and you see the performance of green versus brown energy. And so I guess the takeaway from this is beware of status quo bias. Now let's take it back to oil regions and stability. Stability for oil, as we learned in the oil regions, requires management of the supply side. We're doing it differently in the last 100 years. We do it with governments, and we do it by managing the upstream, the production from the well. Back in the oil regions, they did it in a much more complicated way, but successfully by managing the refining and the transportation of oil primarily. But it's all about stability. It's all about stability. Now, if the market begins to believe that there's no effective swing producer, and we are perpetually on these boom-bust price cycles for oil, that will actually, in some ways, help the transition. It cuts both ways, I think, for renewable energy and alternatives, especially electric vehicles. Again, it was the stability of oil and the belief that it was plentiful that convinced the automakers to go with oil for transportation. If we begin to think that we're on this space mountain ride, you will see, forget about governments, private sector, consumers will want alternatives that are stably priced, as we have in the power sector. We have a lot more fuel diversity in electricity than we do in transportation. So I tell my friends in the oil industry, in some ways you better hope that a swing producer comes back just, to give us some stability in prices and your returns so you can plan and invest, but also to keep your alternatives away, because you know what? You don't need a Paris Agreement if oil is going to be on Space Mountain. Now, of course, the other side of that is it's really hard to assess the value and the profitability of investments in electric vehicle supply chains or hydrogen or other things, or if you're a car maker, EVs versus ICE cars, gasoline cars, if the price of gasoline is wildly volatile, right? At a $2 gasoline, we've seen consumers are going to prefer heavier, thirstier trucks and are happy to use gasoline. But at $4, that's going to promote both fuel efficiency in cars. They will opt for that, and EVs. And again, my take is there's very little evidence, again, that governments are going to bludgeon consumers into cars they don't want to buy. So this is really going to be driven by consumer behavior. So it cuts both ways there on the transition. So look, I've gone on long enough. I hope you stayed with me. I can't read the room because I can't see the room. But I thank you for your indulgence, for me not being there, and for listening to this. And I know we have very smart folks in the crowd, so this is not just a question period, Andrew, but I'd welcome comments, views, and I want to learn from you as much as I can. So with that, thank you, and Andrew, back over to you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Bob. Great tour de force there. And that is all, of course, outlined, a lot of it in Bob's book from Columbia University Press. We can take maybe one or two questions, given the time. We are over time, and we have the next panel, and we have one of the, Amy Myers-Jaffe is going to have to jump off a little bit early. So does anybody have a question for Bob before he jumps off? He is coming back, and I really believe he's coming back, and so you might get a chance to corner him next year after this, you've been able to digest this. But does anybody have a quick question or two for Bob before he logs off? Sure, Gordon.
Why is it that shale producers can't be swing producers?
Okay. Did you hear that, Bob?
I didn't hear the question,
Yeah.
no. Could you repeat it, please?
Why can't shale producers be swing producers? That was the question.
I can't hear it, Andrew, sorry. You have to just louder and slower if you would.
Sure. The question is, why can't why can't shale producers be swing producers?
Great question. If I can go back, let's just go look at our chart. A swing producer must be willing to subordinate earning returns on their production, financial returns, to the goal of stabilizing the global oil market. Our shale oil companies do not have that incentive. They're not legally allowed to have that incentive. They must earn a higher return for their investors. And they don't have the legal, even if you said, well, let's assume the shale companies decided it's in their interest to collude and manage supply to earn the higher return. That would actually be a reasonable argument. Then you have the other problem called the Sherman Antitrust Act. You'd have to change the law to allow them to collude. And I don't see political support for that. But even if you did that, let's assume we said, you know what, we're going to have to legalize a cartel. We're going to allow the shale companies to get together and adjust production to keep oil, to stabilize prices. Well, then the other attribute of a swing producer is you have to be willing to shut off or turn on a lot of oil, right? In a crude market of about 80 million barrels a day, total liquids is 100, but crude is about 80, to manage that thing, especially with all the black swans that have been hitting the market recently on the supply and the demand side, COVID, et cetera, you need to go up by 1 million barrels a day, 1.5 million barrels a day. Saudi Arabia just cut voluntarily an extra 1 million barrels a day. Would shale companies be able to do that? I don't think so. Shale is more like a manufacturing process. Producers, both in the oil regions that did this, and then in Texas Railroad Commission days in the 40s and 50s, and now these are what we call primary drive wells. These are wells that are naturally flowing. You can easily regulate by turning them off at the Christmas tree at the wellhead. Shale is more like a manufacturing process. You just can't cycle that up and down. So I think the reasons in this table right there make it very clear why shale oil is not able. It's not configured that way. It doesn't have the right kind of oil production, and it's legally not allowed to do so.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it at that because we're over time. Bob, first of all, thanks so much for your presentation. As a token of appreciation from the conference and from me personally, Bob's book, when you read it, you'll find a tremendous amount in here from the Derek's Handbook of Petroleum. That's what he used to call a lot of his early volatility data, which of course is from the Derek, and which today, Bob, you don't know that yet, but has a picture of you on the cover, beaming in as you are now from North Carolina. So we'll make sure to get a copy or two to you, but not just that. In the bookstore, which of Friends of Drake Well, they sell original copies of the Derek's Handbook of Petroleum from 1898, and I have a copy. You can't see it here for you, and it's in the original wrapping paper from the Derek Publishing Company, Inc.
Wow.
And this I'll make sure to hand off to you down in D.C. Your work on the early oil industry and its applicability to the modern era is fantastic. We look forward to hosting you next year. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Bob McNally.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks,
Thank
Bob.
you. And you're going to love Amy Jaffe. I'm sorry to miss that, and everybody else. Have a great afternoon, Andrew. Thank you again, and see you all in person next year. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. If we could go to the next session, if we could have Ed Chow and Sid Green come up. Sorry? Yes, she does, and I'll explain it. We're going to go with Flannery, then Amy, then Sid. Sid's a good sport. He doesn't mind batting cleanup, I think. So, without further, make sure we have Amy logged on, and do we have Flannery logged on? Okay. Ed, why don't you lead us off here, and we'll see where we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Andrew, and a great presentation from our friend Bob McNally, and our hearts go to his wife and his wife's family, friends on the tragedy that they had. So this is what's called a scene setter. Now, in most of these conferences, I'm more like a scene chewer than a scene setter. So either Andrew doesn't know me very well, or he knows me too well and wants me to moderate rather than to be the disruptor that I usually am at these conferences. Those of you who were here a year ago will remember that I said at that time that I thought that the Russia's attack on Ukraine, starting February 24th of 2022, was probably the biggest energy shock the world had experienced since at least the 1970s. Now, actually the response was more moderate than I would have guessed for a lot of reasons that we don't have the time to get into now. But of course now we also have Hamas's attack on Israel over the last weekend. And so we may be talking about a period that is even more volatile than the 1970s. So if I was confused a year ago, I'm even more confused today. The demand for oil continues to grow. We are hitting peak global oil consumption, yet the International Energy Agency tells us that we will arrive at peak demand sometime this decade. U.S. production is at peak, and we've had these geopolitical shocks, yet the market response, the oil market response in pricing has been relatively muted. I mean, if you look at Brent oil prices the past week, it really hasn't done anything, in spite of that I would think that a risk premium would be put on future prices. So as I said, I'm more confused than ever. Lucky for me and for you, we have three excellent speakers to sort things out and tell us the factual reality that we have today, and help us think about what that means as we move forward on the conference. First, we have Dr. Flannery from RAND. I'm not going to take the time to read their bios, partly because we're running out of time. You can Google them. They're all very famous people. So there's no problem doing that. I don't know what she's doing up at this hour in Santa Monica or wherever she is on the West Coast, being very patient with us. And then to be followed by a good friend again, Amy Meyer Jaffe of NYU, who also have followed the Middle East for many, many years, and I hope Amy will enlighten us and update us on that. And then we have our friend Sid Green, who I'm proud to say have been in the oil industry longer than I have. And he is a real practitioner of the industry and will give us a good technical grounding on where we are today on energy and climate. So with that, Dr. Dolan, we can start with her if she's logged on. Okay.
Yes, thank you. I think I need someone else, you to stop sharing for me to share my screen. First, there we go. Okay. Of course. Okay, actually, Andrew, do you have my slides still?
Yes, I do. I can just get those up.
I don't know if he's in the room still. Okay, there we go. Thanks all for your patience there. The RAND VPN is a little finicky, but we are on track now. Okay, so good morning, everybody from Santa Monica. I'm an environmental engineer at the RAND Corporation, and today I'm going to give a very brief overview of some of the science behind climate change and some of the recent policy measures we're doing to address it. Just a quick caveat, I'm sure most people in the room know most of or all of what I'm going to present, but it'll be helpful to have everybody at the same baseline, I think. Okay, Before we kind of jump into the meat of everything, I think it's really helpful to understand that we're seeing the impacts of climate change already, and sometimes in very unintuitive ways. So for example, the cold snap in Texas in 2021 was worsened by climate change and made the severity of it was made possible by climate change because the warming of the Arctic weakened the polar vortex, which allowed cooler air to flow further south than it usually would. That's one example. We're also seeing intense flooding in Pakistan that inundated about a third of the country last year, in addition to the incredibly severe heat wave that affected both India and Pakistan. We're also in the midst of a mega drought here in the Southwest here in America, which is the worst drought that this region has experienced in about 1,200 years. And we're also seeing the effects of pretty severe sea level rise already. And we know that these effects are going to worsen over time, which I'll get into a little bit later. Okay, so why is this all happening? This is probably a very familiar figure to most people, but I'll walk through everything and make sure we're on the same page here. So the Earth system gets or basically all of its energy from the sun, from solar radiation. And that radiation goes through the atmosphere. Some bounces immediately off of the atmosphere, but most of it travels through the atmosphere. Some then is reflected off of the polar ice caps, other snow and ice, anything with a high albedo, or basically a high reflectivity on Earth is reflected off. Most of the radiation is absorbed by the Earth, by the land surface and by the oceans. That radiation then is re-emitted as infrared radiation, so at a lower wavelength frequency. And it is re-emitted out towards space. It goes back out through the atmosphere, some of it, and some of it is absorbed by gases in the atmosphere and then is re-emitted. And some of that re-emission goes back into Earth. So we can think of this as an energy balance. All of the energy in equals all of the energy out. But it's also really important to know that we need the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere to survive. Without our atmosphere, without the greenhouse gases, the average surface temperature of the Earth would be around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Right now, it's around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So we can see how much of a difference those gases make. It's also really important to realize how small of a percentage these gases that actually absorb infrared radiation are. So most of our atmosphere is nitrogen and oxygen, and about 0.04% of the atmosphere is made up of greenhouse gases. So we can see that that level of greenhouse gases really, if 0.04% basically makes up about 60 degrees Fahrenheit of added heat, we can see the importance of that concentration. And we can see this a little more clearly if we look at the correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide concentration. And this is from the ice core record going back over 400,000 years. So you can see that there's a very direct relationship between these two variables. And something else that you probably see as we go toward the present, the rate of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere has shot up precipitously. And actually, we're a lot closer to about 420 parts per million in the atmosphere right now. So this plot is a little old. We're closer to about 420 here. So, and you might be wondering, okay, well, what about temperature then? We know that temperature lags carbon dioxide as a variable. We know that carbon dioxide concentration goes up first, and that will be followed by an increase in temperature. And indeed, we can see that if we look at the plot on the left here. So this is showing global average surface temperature in the past couple thousand years. And this last kind of 70-year period is what has been observed by instruments. And then the period before that has been reconstructed by climate models. But we can see it's a very similar pattern to what we saw in the previous plot here has been observed in temperature additionally. And so we can see the correlation here. We might want to ask ourselves, okay, but to what extent have humans actually played a role? And that is what this plot on the right here is showing. These plots are, by the way, all from the summary for policymakers from the most recent IPCC report. So if anyone wants to look at that later, it's out there. It's a wonderful, wonderful report. But this plot is showing, basically, the orange is showing what we have observed through time. That's the black line. And then the orange is just modeled reconstruction and projection. And then the green is showing a counterfactual scenario of what would have happened in the absence of human emissions. And we can very clearly see the difference here. So we can say, without a shadow of a doubt here, that humans have had an impact on climate. We are contributing to climate change and to warming overall. Now, it's kind of helpful to talk about some of the data sources that go behind this. We've looked at the ice core record here. We've also looked at modeled results. But there's a lot of different types of climate data that are available to us. I would say the one that people most often think of when they think of climate data is the data that are derived from modeled outputs. That is one very important type, but it's also necessary that models are informed by observational and historical data. So we also have instrumental data, think weather stations. So these will tell us meteorological variables like precipitation, humidity, temperature, and that'll give us information in the past couple hundred years. And then if we want to look back farther, we have the paleoclimate record. So we look at this with the ice cores. That's one example of paleoclimate data. We also have information from tree rings and also from sediments from lake deposits. All of this will tell us valuable information that is much farther back than our instruments could tell us. And then finally, we have socioeconomic and other historical data that are available. So these are things like if a massive drought was reported one year in some location, or the Nile flood records are another pretty famous example of this. And so what we can do then is match all of these different sources of data together to make sure that they line up and tell a cohesive story. And then we can put that into and use those historical sources of data to calibrate our climate models. And then if we are sure that our climate models can accurately reproduce what we have observed in the past, then we can use them to project into the future. And that is a very important distinction, I think, that I want to make clear. So projection versus prediction, we are not trying to predict what's going to happen in the future because we cannot, as the next slide will go into. So whereas forecast is what we expect will happen, projection is what we usually talk about in the climate community because we're more concerned with what is possible under different scenarios. So I'll go into that a little bit here. This plot is showing global average temperature out to the end of the century. And so we have our historical observed period here on the left-hand side in black. And then we have our future temperature scenarios on the right here. And the different colors are showing different scenarios. So there are different, so we have the shared socioeconomic pathways, which are driven by different socioeconomic drivers. Think population, GDP, rate of technological change, things like that. And then we have the representative concentration pathways, which are telling us about the amount of radiative forcing in the atmosphere. And so we also need to be aware that there's a difference between the radiative forcing and the carbon dioxide concentration, basically, and the amount of warming that we're going to see. And that is what we call the equilibrium climate sensitivity. So ECS is the amount of warming that we're going to experience given a doubling of carbon dioxide concentration. And different climate models have different ECSs that they solve for. Climate models are basically driven by the same set of partial differential equations. We have conservation of energy, we have conservation of mass, carbon cycle, et cetera. But their parameterizations and the way they represent certain feedbacks are different. And those differences they make a lot of uncertainty. So we can see that in basically the different colors here. So the red band, that is showing the uncertainty in the SSP3, RCP7 scenario, and those are all from the different models. And then we can also see this band of uncertainty in the SSP1, RCP26 scenario. So it's quite a substantial amount of uncertainty, and that type of uncertainty was what kind of governs the near to midterm. When we're talking about long term, out to the end of the century, that's where socioeconomic drivers come into play a lot more. And then one source of uncertainty that the climate models don't represent well are tipping points. And so these are nonlinearities in the system where a small change in the input results in a large change in the impact in the output. So this could happen due to a shutting down of the Atlantic meridional circulation, the ocean currents. It could also happen melting of the polar ice caps, dieback of the Amazon rainforest. And we have a certain understanding of the temperature thresholds where we might pass those tipping points. But again, we don't know exactly how many emissions will get us to those thresholds, nor do we know with any degree of certainty what is likely to happen after those thresholds are passed. We do know that climate change will speed up. We'll have a positive feedback, the rate of change will accelerate, but we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. So putting uncertainty aside for a second, we can talk about what is likely to occur if we meet different warming thresholds. So again, this is different than amounts of emissions. This is purely going based on temperature. So we know that extremes are going to become more frequent and more intense. And I think this plot, again, is coming from the IPCC Summary for Policymakers, but I think it tells the story very well. So if we think about an event that happens on average once every 10 years in terms of its severity, at present, we're at about 1 degree C of warming, a little bit above that right now. So even now, that 1 in 10 year event in pre-industrial times is happening about 3 times as likely now. 3 times as frequently, rather. If we look at the high warming scenario, 4 degrees C, which is equivalent to around 7 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, again, this is a global average, 7 degrees Fahrenheit. That is going to happen almost 10 times as frequently. So the 1 in 10 year event in historical times is happening now about once every year. And we can see that if we think about that 1 in 10 year event at that warming threshold, that is now 5 degrees C hotter, around 9 degrees Fahrenheit, we'll say. And this is more pronounced if we look at more severe events. So a 1 in 50 year event is now at the high scenario of warming. It's 40 times as likely to occur. So we can also see that this is going to happen to a lesser extent, but will still happen for heavier precipitation and also drought. So extreme precipitation will lead to flooding. That is going to become more likely with more warming as the atmosphere is able to hold more moisture. A 1 in 10 year event in historical times is now going to be 30% wetter. And we can say the same for drought. So we have about an increase of 1 standard deviation in drought, which is a lot. So basically we see that all of the extremes of different meteorological variables are going to get worse due to climate change. So what are we doing about it? I know that, so some of this might be overlap with other presentations, but I'll just give a very brief rundown of this. The Paris Agreement was established in 2015, and it's made up of commitments from different countries based on their abilities. And some of these commitments are conditional, and some of them are unconditional. And the conditions are based on funding, basically. And so those conditional commitments are coming from lesser developed countries. These commitments are updated every 5 years. And the most recent US goal is to reduce emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. President Biden has also made targets to 100% clean electricity by 2035 and to reach net zero by 2050. And so to put that into some perspective, currently about 30% of total emissions come from the electric sector. And then total emissions also come from transportation sector, industry, agriculture, housing. So that's why net zero is a much larger goal and it comes later. We also recently passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which commits about $400 billion in clean energy and in climate investments, and the CHIPS and Science Act, which is about $70 billion towards zero carbon industries and towards climate research. And so we can think of these two acts as kind of carrots rather than sticks of climate policy, where you might think of a stick as being something like a carbon tax. Rather, we're incentivizing cleaner technologies to make it easier for them to enter the market. And with that, I'll end it here, very quick overview, but if anyone has any questions, they can reach me at this email.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nolan, for this very thorough presentation. In the interest of time, let's just move on to Amy. Amy, are you ready?
Oh, I'm ready.
Okay, you're on.
Well, I'm really glad to be here with you today, and I'm sorry that my schedule is such that I have to stay with the conference's originally slotted time because I have other appointments and commitments. But it's really a pleasure to be here and think about Titusville's role in history. It's been a long journey since the first oil well was drilled here in Titusville. And just to sort of point out, I know Bob gave sort of the history of the oil industry, but since we're also have on the docket to talk about energy transition, I did want to point out that we had a huge innovation that came out of Titusville. It wasn't, when people say it was the first oil well, I think that underscores or understates what actually happened, which was that Titusville had a thriving salt mining, well drilling industry. And Edwin Drake realized or thought about or had the initiative to think that if he used a drive pipe, which was to take actual sections of the pipe, because, you know, pipe was used in the salt process, but not as a drilling technology, that if he took sections of the cast iron pipe and drove it into the shaft to protect the drill bit from cave-ins, that would allow him to go deeper, and that might mean that you could produce oil. And of course, we all know the history of the thing, that he was successful, and I'm not sure he envisioned the revolutionary change that was going to come from that application of drive pipe to becoming the largest, one of the largest global industries for decades, driving energy transformation. I'm not sure he had that vision. I think he was just, thinking he could make some money with this technology and innovation. But I want to point out, which I guess people probably know because you're steeped in your own history, but at the time that he made this innovation, the whaling industry, which was the previous supplier of material for kerosene, was the 5th largest industry in the United States. And I feel particularly well placed to mention that because I am from Salem, Massachusetts, which was one of the pivotal locations of the whaling industry. And I'm guessing that the younger generation has no idea that the whaling industry of New England was the 5th largest industry in the United States. Maybe a few people who were assigned to read Moby Dick. But I think that's not widely known. And so, in thinking about Pennsylvania today and its position in innovation, it's very interesting to know that coincident with this wonderful event, the US government has announced 2 of its 7 hydrogen/carbon sequestration hubs are going to take place in Pennsylvania. And that is on top of the policies that the state has put on for tax credits to propel that industry forward. So I think it's a really interesting time to think about what Bob talked about and to think about the role that alternative energy might play in the so-called volatility of oil prices. So what Bob didn't mention is that the Saudi government today has been really implementing a pretty sophisticated and somewhat successful policy that is literally aimed to end volatility in the price of oil. And when they implement that, it's not just through OPEC Plus, which Bob talked about, it's also through the careful monitoring of who is in the market and what motivates them in their trading. And one of the interesting developments in the oil market is that you do have these financial players in the futures market who use computers, big data, and AI to move themselves in and out of the oil market. And that's based on historical trends for movements in oil price. When the oil price gets to a certain level, there's a tendency for it to go to a next resistance point. So if an oil price, for example, when the oil price was in the high 80s, there was a moment where it would be possible to get the price to lift quickly to $92 because you would be able to play those technical trends. But one of the things about these algorithms that they've become more sophisticated over time, and so they're very sensitive to major changes in events that can change sentiment in the market. And so they're programmed to pick those up. And so I think it's not uninteresting that earlier this fall, the Saudi oil minister, instead of having an OPEC Plus meeting, there was a phone call and Saudi Arabia made an agreement to announce jointly with Russia that Saudi Arabia was going to make an additional production cut. And that hit these technicals and algorithm traders and pushed the market up above $90, which was the Saudi target. So, I do believe that the Saudis also, of course, acted with OPEC Plus, as Bob mentioned, to keep the market from going into the 60s and down as there were concerns about the global economy and China's economy. And so, there was this effort to stabilize the market. And actually, interestingly, during this period, over the summer and into recent months, China has been hugely stockpiling oil. And that also has helped raise the market. And some people have suggested that China is trying to assist Russia by buying more of its oil. And because its own economy is flagging, that oil has to go into storage. And so the Chinese are having very high storage levels, some of which leading to high refining runs, producing diesel fuel that's not needed in the local economy. So as we move forward, some questions that arise is how, because the Saudi policy has been very successful, over the period of several months, and because Bob has also introduced the idea that on a long-term basis, it's very difficult to remove oil price volatility. I think we have a lot of questions of uncertainty. Will the war in the Middle East spread and change the outlook for oil supply? Will that trigger changes in the oil market that bring us to a higher price? But then, you could look to the flip side, which is that if we have difficulties in all these different hotspots around the world, and China's economy continues to be a problem, and we had a high oil price, and that led to more inflation, which made it harder for the Fed to implement a soft landing through the flattening of interest rates. You could imagine that we could get to a situation that would look a little bit more like 2008, 2009, where we get a very high oil price that leads to a banking and financial crisis, which has happened multiple times, is what I've written my book about, oil, dollars, debt, and crises. And so I do think that the Fed and others are working very hard to prevent that from happening. But the history of volatility is not just as Bob describes it, because, of course, there's more interactions than just what happens among parties that try to regulate the price of oil. It's a much more complex landscape that involves the intersection between interest rates, inflation, and the health of the banking sector, and also reflects on how all those interactions implicate the real estate sector, which is very vulnerable in the United States, already in crisis in China, and possibly vulnerable in other locations as well. So I hesitate to just say that the rise in an oil price that might come about because of these terrible events in the Middle East might be good for the industry, because on some level, if it turns out to be not able to be controlled through intervention, or because the conflict itself is more devastating in not only humanitarian terms, but in economic terms, then I do think we could be in for a very turbulent period. But the interesting thing that's changed structurally, that is different this time than all the past times that I've written about with this sort of link between oil and banking crises, is that we've never had, in '73, we had Jimmy Carter famously put a solar panel on the roof of the White House and hope that that could be symbolically significant. But of course, we had no alternative energy at our disposal at that time. And even in the 90s, and even, maybe more recently, there weren't that many options. But today, we have a lot of technology coming forward that is available. And my imagining is that over time, what has been what we call in economics an inelastic commodity. In other words, the price of oil goes up and none of us that use oil have any choice. We still have to drive our cars. We still have to make petrochemicals. We still need to do all these things with oil. As the price of oil goes up, and historically, oil gets eliminated from certain sectors. So for example, in past oil crises, we have basically washed oil out of the entire power sector. And the question is, will all these technologies coming forward, including the hydrogen hubs that the US government is promoting, that we've got hydrogen being promoted in Chile and Australia, even in Saudi Arabia, will an oil price crisis coming, if it comes down the road, really hasten these technologies and hasten energy efficiency technologies and hasten the adoption of electric cars. And I think if we do see that come, because that is one of the results that happened as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is that more renewable energy has been installed in Europe, and the number of batteries installed in Germany to pair with solar rooftop has grown astronomically in just 1 year. And so the question is, moving forward, how does Pennsylvania think about its future economic development, with the combination of the fact that, of course, the United States has become a major exporter of not only crude oil and liquefied natural gas, but also petroleum products. And eventually, I think now with the Inflation Reduction Act, we could be a major exporter of clean, low carbon technologies and or ammonia/hydrogen. So I leave you with the promise of the potential that a lot of times when the oil price goes up and a lot of tax revenue comes in to an oil producing, gas producing state like Pennsylvania, there's going to be a debate about how to invest that money in the future. And anyway, I welcome you to read my book, Energy's Digital Future, and to think about how best to spend any windfall to ensure that Pennsylvania has a strong economic future and upskilling and retooling of workers to meet how the world might move forward in energy and in other technologies as we weather and hopefully get past today's crises. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amy, for reminding us of the role that technology plays in energy, as well as the feedback loop between energy markets and the broader macroeconomy, and also bring it home to Pennsylvania again. We're really short of time, so I'm going to let Sid Green make his opening remarks. And I know you have a couple of slides, Sid, so I'm going to sit in the audience one more time.
I'll stand here if I might. And if I might, so I can see the screen too. Let's go to the next slide, please. And I don't think I can change the slides here, can I? And one more slide, please. Okay, let me give just a little update on the energy transition, which is underway. You've heard about. The biggest thing that has happened for the energy transition, both U.S. and globally, is the switching somewhat of natural gas for coal. Natural gas is the one and only big thing that has so far had an impact on carbon dioxide emissions going on now. Solar and wind electricity in the U.S. are significant. About 11.5% of U.S. electricity in 2022 was from solar, and about 3.5% in 2022 was wind, and 3.5% was from solar, so 11.5% from wind energy for the U.S. Electric vehicles are becoming significant. It looks like this year, about 8.5% or so of all of the cars and light trucks sold in the U.S. and even worldwide. It's about the same U.S. and worldwide will be electric vehicles of some form. You hear other numbers, 10%, and that's true too if you consider only just looking at cars and take out trucks, since all the EVs, almost all the EVs worldwide are cars. It comes out to about 10% of the cars, but about 8.5% of, or 8.7% of all cars and light trucks. Biofuels are being experienced. I think about 4% of U.S. diesel now is what is called biofuels, biorenewable or biofuel. The largest biofuel, of course, by far is converting corn to alcohol for transportation fuels, and soybeans are being added now, and you might speculate as to which state was the most in favor of that. I think Iowa is the largest soybean producer in the world. There's decades of information, however, decades, questioning whether or not converting corn to a transport fuel really lowers greenhouse gas emissions. Geothermal energy, hydrogen, carbon capture and sequestration is all being pursued. Geothermal electricity is about 1% of U.S. electricity at present. Of course, hydrogen and carbon sequestration we're going to hear more about, and I'll comment a little bit more on those in a minute. And of course, nuclear, about 20% of U.S. electricity comes from the 50 nuclear power plants, about 93 nuclear reactors in the United States. You all are probably aware that we have a bit of an issue on the nuclear fuel. We've been buying our nuclear enriched uranium that we needed and that we didn't have from our good friends, the Russians. And of course, that's a problem now. But small scale, I don't ever think we will see another large-scale nuclear power plant constructed in the U.S. The last two came online, 2 reactors came online just now in Georgia. I don't think we'll ever see another large-scale. But the small-scale nuclear, small-scale modular, SMRs, small modular reactors, and even micro-reactors that fit in a shipping container really look exciting to me. But U.S. is so encumbered with regulations. They're not bad, but I mean, so encumbered with regulations and uncertainty that I don't see anything happening in the U.S. very quickly. There's 2 small reactors that affect us in Utah. The one came in Wyoming by TerraPower that is setting to go forward. It's on indefinite hold for lack of enriched fuel. Don't know where it's going to come from at the moment. And one in Idaho National Lab on the reservation that's going forward, a small-scale modular. China, however, has, I believe, 24 small-scale reactors under construction. And the bottom line is the U.S. has lowered its carbon dioxide emissions. Next slide. And we'll lower them more. The next slide, if I could, please. Next thing is I want to just mention some what I call misunderstandings. There are many misunderstandings today about nuclear energy. I even heard some in the presentations, and I'm not going to, I don't want to go into detail on those, but one big one is the phasing out of oil, gas, and coal. It's not going to happen. There's nothing on the horizon that suggests we can do that. The best projection that makes sense suggests that by 2050, the world will likely be using between 50 and 100% more energy. Musk, spoke recently, he claims it'll be 200 to 300%, but 50 to 100% more energy. And it's likely that oil, gas, and coal will still be producing the majority of that energy. Probably 70% or so is a good estimate by 2050. There will be some fuel switching, though, I think, between oil, gas, and coal. And you all know now that oil consumption today is probably the most ever, about 103 million barrels a day right now. Coal is the biggest ever, it was over 8 billion tons last year. It's going to be expected to be greater this year globally. And natural gas consumption is about 400 billion standard cubic feet a day. It's a huge amount globally. And it's growing. It's growing not only in the U.S. a bit, but worldwide a lot. There's confusion about U.S. energy versus global. That's confusing even in the same article. Sometimes people will switch back and forth between speaking about the U.S. energy consumption versus the global energy consumption. And just to clarify, the global energy consumption. Global energy consumption from electricity is about 20% of the market. So when you're working on electricity globally, you're only working on about 20% of the current today world energy consumption. It's about double that in the US and Europe. Each one, it's more like 40% in the US of our energy consumption is from electricity. Next thing is the primary versus secondary energy. The primary energy sources are oil, gas, coal, solar, wind, geothermal. But hydrogen, which we hear a lot about, is not an energy source. It's an energy carrier, or an energy, you might call it an energy battery, if you will. Hydrogen, as biofuels, have to be made from other energy sources. And they don't grow on trees, so to speak. When you make hydrogen or biofuels, it takes more energy than you get out of it. Right now, the energy conversion for making hydrogen is about 65% through electrolysis. And the world makes a lot of hydrogen. People aren't aware of that. The world produces about 94 million tons of hydrogen annually. It's a lot. It's almost 100% made from natural gas, a little bit from coal, and it's all used today for refining. It's essential for refining and for fertilizer. And if you don't make fertilizer, the world will starve, and they will starve quickly. So there's a big difference between primary and non-primary energy sources. And the last thing that maybe is misunderstanding is solar and wind really work. Solar photovoltaic works, and so does wind. But the footprint is big. If you want to replace, say, 1 million barrels of oil a day, just 1 million, where we're using about 103 million a day globally, you would need about 500,000 acres of solar collectors in the Mojave Desert to produce the same energy, watt hours or BTUs, over a 5-year period. Now that's not, I'm not projecting anything, I'm just telling you the facts. So they work, but the footprint is very big. We've done a good job in the US at harvesting the low-hanging fruit with solar and wind, in my opinion. We've added quite a bit, as I mentioned, 11.5% from electricity from solar, 3.5% from wind, and 3.5% from solar. But it's getting harder now to add more to our solar and wind. It's almost impossible to get permitting now for a solar windmill in a populated area, and so we're going more offshore. Offshore is complicated because it takes an awfully lot of cement to hold down a ground-mounted, and a floating wind platform is probably even more complicated. So I'm for them, but I'm just noting that the footprint is big. I have solar panels in my house. Footprint is big. We have about 160,000 acres of solar panels installed in the US right now, as we speak. About 4% are rooftop, the rest are farms. Let me go to the next slide, if I could, please. You know, I feel a little bit like I'm the one telling you the emperor has no clothes, but somebody needs to tell that. Unrealistic expectations. You know, it seems we've gotten into the position where we can just make wild presentations, wild expectations, wild projections of things, and of course that sells better in the media than some complicated discussion about immigration or taxes or even energy. But here is some unrealistic presentation that it simply is a fact that these rapid expansions of new energy concepts, the so-called the hockey stick growth, read the financial journals, they're not going to happen. It just doesn't happen that quickly. And so these rapid projections that we're going to suddenly switch to all electric cars quickly, not going to happen. Over expectation of global CO2 emissions reduction. Right now, the world emits globally about 38 billion tons of carbon dioxide annually from burning fossil fuel. It's a lot. It's a lot. As was mentioned, the CO2 in the atmosphere is about 420 parts per million average right now globally. So we're putting a lot in from oil, gas, and coal. And we're talking about collecting carbon and injecting it in the ground for sequestration. Well, right now, the world does collect about 41 million tons a year. It's almost all used, almost 100% for enhanced oil recovery. That's not really sequestration because almost all that comes back out with the produced oil. And so but let's say you met the DOE. I don't know if it's a goal exactly, but they've set a position. They'd like to capture 100 million tons a year by 2030, and that's been extended now, I think, to 2035. It's not going to happen in 2030 for sure. Well, that would be less than 1% of global. Even if we made that projection, it'd be less than 1% of total. So it's a good idea, I think, to collect, but it's hard to see how we could ever collect enough to do any good. And I'm not projecting, I'm just telling you the facts. There's a failure to consider consequences. Wow. Energy is big, and it's important. And you have to have energy the same as you have to have air and water to live. You die if you don't have energy, and you die pretty quick. And so there are consequences as we want to change. And we're seeing an awfully lot of matters, a lot of issues in the United States and other places too, not in my backyard. And I have to admit, I guess I'm one of those. I don't want a lot of stuff in my backyard either. And I don't have an answer for that. But you're finding it very difficult to run pipelines right now. The thought of running electric transmission lines are very difficult to do. And the thought of putting nuclear reactors in populated areas is complicated. So I don't have an answer to that. It simply is a case in a democracy that how do you handle, not in my backyard, and that means the consequences as we try to change energy are great. Clearly, one of the consequences we're seeing for sure is alternate energy concepts are not cheaper. They are more expensive. Someone tells you solar is cheap. Well, how come is your electric bill going up then? Now, I'm for solar to the extent, but it's not cheaper. I don't fool myself. But the most preposterous of all, can you imagine this? That we are going to do all of these at the same time. Rapid growth of all of those. Rapid growth of electric vehicles, solar and wind electricity, rapid growth of the grid expansion, rapid growth of hydrogen. The list goes on. We don't have the labor supply in the U.S. We don't have the technology supply. We don't have the raw material supply. This is absolutely preposterous. Next slide, please. Maybe you could argue we do one of those, maybe. The big questions to ask. Now, we are lowering U.S. emissions. My understanding, I think we're lower than the Kyoto emissions, which we never signed on to, but we are lowering it because we are a country where our energy consumption is more amenable to being able to lower the emission. About 40% of our energy consumption is electric, another 20-some% is transport, and those are easier things to do. We don't make much cement or steel or aluminum. Those are cement is the biggest CO2 emissions contributor in the whole world. Well, we put that in another country does that. So that doesn't count for us, even though we use a lot of cement. And we should. But anyway, the big questions are, we don't know the costs or the consequences of the energy transition. And to say there won't be any or that they'll all be good is absolute nonsense. We don't know what the emissions reduction, how it will affect other countries. It's hard for me to see how countries like China, India, Africa, Russia are going to pay a lot of attention to the U.S. They're struggling, most of those countries, to feed their people and educate their people. And you go and tell them, would you mind not burning your coal because it emits the atmosphere and let your people starve? I don't think that's going to happen. The president of Uganda spoke at the United Nations 2 years ago now, right now, and he said very bluntly at the United States, I will not sacrifice the prosperity of my people for the Western countries' climate goals, very bluntly. And finally, the last one is, will the U.S. continue its effort in the face of unrealistic estimates as they're proving to be unrealistic? Will the U.S. revolt and say, hey, this is nonsense? Anyway, the last slide I have And I know I am the bearer of telling the emperor he has no clothes, but I think it is a big problem, emitting a lot of carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels. I think that we should try to solve it. We should try to reduce it. We are reducing U.S. emissions. And I think the biggest thing that we should add to our list to do is we should be looking at the complete cycle analysis of emission. The energy transition was not started to find new energy concepts. It wasn't started for that reason. It was started to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from the burning of fossil fuels. We've gotten off track, in my opinion, in that we haven't been looking at the complete cycle. For example, I don't see how hydrogen works, but maybe I just don't understand it enough. Because when you look at hydrogen, if you say you're going to make it from clean solar energy, that's good, but a gigawatt of solar energy, a big gigawatt farm, which would be huge, solar farm, will only produce about 70,000 tons of hydrogen a year over a 5-year period. That assumes you can use all the electricity when the sun shines. That's good, but we already make 94 million tons, so adding another 70,000 isn't a very large part of that. The largest solar plant in the world, you know, is in India. They rated it 2.2 gigawatts, and they said it's something over 10,000 acres of collectors. That's not the field, that's collectors alone. So I think we should look at the complete cycle. I don't understand carbon capture. It's a great idea, but when you're trying to capture in the air, for example, something that only is in concentrations of 400 parts per million, to capture a ton of carbon, you have to run a lot of air through your system to collect a ton of carbon. So I don't see how that works either. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Sid, and thank you for running through the portfolio of energy tools at our disposal and also the harsh realities of how quickly things can transition. Sometimes, because of my background, I say to people, no, let's stipulate that climate change is real. Let's not argue about that, but is climate policy real? That's really the question that hopefully the rest of the day we'll be able to address. We're really short of time and because of the late start. So if you have one or two burning questions that for our panelists, otherwise, if I could ask you to reserve those questions for later to the panels who will be coming behind us, as well as the experts who will still be around for coffee breaks and so on. Burning question. Andrew, I turn it back to you.
Oh, wow. Great. Thank you, Ed, so much for that great moderation. And I know you like to stir the pot, and I know that you haven't given up on that process. So we're running a little bit over time. First of all, let's give a great thanks for that very thorough panel. One of the favorite things every day when I worked in government was my morning intel briefing. And that briefing, you didn't agree with everything in the briefing, but it helped to know the facts for when you went in and talked to the boss, or when the government announces a major program that maybe you agree with or don't agree with. You have to know what that actually is. And so what I liked about all those presentations is that A, it gave us both sides, and then B, it drilled it down on Pennsylvania, and it hopefully will inform the later sessions today, and that was always our goal. So really appreciated that. Let's take a very brief break, 10 minutes. We need to be back here at 11:15. There is coffee, I believe, out the back, and we're going to be going into the next panel, which led by Michael Ratner on balancing national security, economic prosperity, environmental sustainability. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in 10.